creativity, the ability to transcend traditional ideas through the use of imagination. Since the beginning of recorded history, creative works have stirred the soul and inspired the masses. What is this magical mystery? How do we turn that initial spark into something tangible? How can we apply it in our own lives? Join me as we attempt to answer these and other questions as we delve inside the creative spirit.
While working in the steel mills of Cleveland, Ohio, Kevin P. Keating was following his passion to become first a professor of English and then a published author. In 2013, Kevin released his first full-length novel titled The Natural Order of Things, which garnered critical acclaim. Kevin's latest offering, The Captive Condition, is a modern Gothic horror novel set in a Midwestern college town. Just back from the 2015 San Diego ComicCon, where he appeared on the horror thriller panel, please welcome to the show author Kevin P. Keating. Hi, Kevin. Thanks for joining me.
Hello. Thank you for having me.
All right, so with all these interviews, what we really have been doing is starting at the beginning in your childhood. What were some of your earliest recollections of books and literature from your childhood? Would you like to share anything with that with us?
Yeah, I think I started reading pretty steadily around the time I was in 5th grade or so. And I remember Alfred Hitchcock had a series of books called The Three Detectives. And maybe people of a certain age might remember some of those. I think Hitchcock just sort of stamped his name on the books as a form of branding. He never actually wrote any of those things. But it was about, the series was about 3 young kids and going on these absurd adventures. But it was great for a kid like me who was in 5th grade. But then very quickly after that, I graduated, strangely enough, to the works of Stephen King. I remember by 7th grade, I was definitely reading that stuff. And one book that makes a real impression on me is Pet Sematary. And probably it wasn't the sort of thing a 7th grader should have been reading. But I was thinking about this recently. Back in the 80s, mid-80s or so, there really wasn't a huge industry of YA novels like there are today, you know? There's so many different books out there for kids, but we didn't have that stuff. And Stephen King's who I gravitated to. I know a lot of kids my age, some of them were reading Westerns, some were reading sci-fi. That stuff never really appealed to me for some reason. It's always Stephen King, who I think is sometimes unfairly categorized as strictly a horror novelist, but he places such a huge emphasis on the characters in the stories. I think he's even said that Salem's Lot is like Peyton Place with vampires. The emphasis really there is on the Peyton Place aspect. I think I was really caught by King because of his characters, not so much the horror stuff. The horror stuff sold the books for sure, but it was the characterization.
And what was your family background like? Are there any other writers in the family, and were your other creative people, and were your family supportive of you in your writing as a young child?
Well, I grew up on the west side of Cleveland. It was Irish Catholic working class life. Everybody that I know, it's my point of reference, they were all Boilermakers or pipe fitters or iron workers. There were no writers.
Mm-hmm.
To be a writer was a bit unusual, to say the least. And so I was pretty much on my own in that regard. I was just sort of an oddball kid. Instead of going out and playing baseball in the front yard or wrestling with my brothers. And that was the usual pastime. I had 3 brothers, and I think we were expected to clobber each other in the backyard as much as possible. But, you know, I holed myself up in my room, and I was reading and I was writing, and I didn't get too much feedback from adults until I was in high school, maybe. and then a little bit in college. But even then, it was very minimal, I think. I went to St. Ignatius High School, Jesuit prep school on the west side of Cleveland. And even there, I don't think there were too many people active in any sort of artistic endeavors. It seemed as though that kind of school was going to produce a lot of lawyers, that kind of thing. Business people, athletes, definitely. Writing was sort of a sideline, I think. But, you know, a little bit of recognition there, and then in college. But it was a slow process.
Was there some special teacher at high school or college that really you remember as just like where you turned a corner, or somebody that just believed in you or opened the door to creativity to you?
I had one teacher who was, the reason I think he made an impression on me and the reason why I think he liked me so much was because he was a fellow writer. A guy named Dr. Pennock from St. Ignatius, who encouraged me quite a bit. I think we had very different philosophical perspectives, but he was still enthusiastic about my work. And I'll always remember this. Around 15 years old, 16 years old, he would give me his copies of Writer's Digest and Poets and Writers, whatever kind of industry magazine he had in his office. He would give it to me and encourage me to submit my work to all of the markets that I could find. And back then, you know, you didn't have the internet, so you actually had to mail out your stories and put the postage on the envelope and send it out and hope for the best. But he did encourage me quite a bit.
So you were working as a Boilermaker while you were putting yourself through school.
From around the time I was 18 until 28, I worked as a Boilermaker. On and off, I would do this, but sometimes for longer stretches. I had a couple of gigs where I worked for like 2.5 years at a time as a Boilermaker. My very last job, and I'll never forget this one, was at an oil refinery. And there was a terrific explosion and everyone had to evacuate immediately. If you've ever seen the stuff on TV, these oil refinery explosions, they're quite horrifying. And I think I had some post-traumatic stress as a result of that afterwards. I kept reliving that explosion in my head over and over again. But that was my very last job, and I started teaching as an adjunct professor of English after that.
I know your latest novel takes place in a Midwestern university. Is that a case of art imitating life, or?
You know, I love John Banville, and he said, you know, what's fiction and what's autobiography and all of that stuff is such rubbish because the two things are so closely intertwined. It's impossible to separate them. It's true. I'm drawing on some of my own experiences. My first book, just as an obvious example, takes place at a Jesuit high school. I went to Ignatius. But really, I think if anyone went to Ignatius, read the book, they should know by chapter 2 that the whole thing is really fiction. I'm making all of this stuff up. I'm just using that background at Ignatius as a point to where I can jump off into my own creativity. It's the same thing with The Captive Condition, my second book. I teach at Midwestern College, but as you read the book, I think you'll find that it's entirely fictitious, and the college almost becomes peripheral to a lot of the ideas that I'm trying to get to.
So you write on your own. Have you ever done any collaborative work, or do you always work independently, or have you ever like wrote with a partner or somebody else?
No, I've always been by myself, and I very, very rarely even received any kind of editorial feedback on my work because I was publishing in tiny, tiny literary journals. My first book was published by a tiny press called Aqueous Books. She, the editor there, gave me some editorial feedback, though not too much because it was a small outfit. That book was then picked up by Random House and republished as a vintage paperback. But once I got to Pantheon and Vintage in New York City. That was the first time where I really began to experience any sort of collaborative work. My editor really was a great collaborator and careful editor, and gave me lots and lots of honest feedback and sort of guided me in the right direction, I think, with the second book.
Is it hard for you? Are you attached to the way you told her? Are you willing to be open to the feedback from the editors? Or
Well, I'm very happy to have received the feedback, and I learned to enjoy that process, actually. Now, the first round of edits that came through a couple of years ago, I was a bit shocked, horrified. Like, oh, I'm terrible. My editor gave me, a 15-page editorial letter with suggestions, recommendations, criticism, and it made me nervous, paranoid. I think maybe I was also a little bit too attached to the writing. But very quickly after that, I started to look forward to his commentary. And I think really what it boils down to, probably with any kind of collaborative enterprise, if you're writing something with someone, is how much do you trust that other person? And I quickly came to trust my editor, Tim O'Connell, at Pantheon. Great guy, and his insights are absolutely terrific, and it helped me a lot shape the book. And the book has received some really outstanding critical acclaim, and I think a lot of that has to do with Tim's patience and his willingness to critique my work honestly. And then, of course, my willingness to accept those criticisms and not be too attached to my writing and to spend time on revision.
well, let's take a little time to actually get into describing the writing process. And what do you have anything? Do you have like a ritual, or what gets you in the mood, or what is your process for people out there that are wanting to become writers themselves?
Well, with Captive Condition, we had some deadlines that I had to meet, and maybe those were a little bit artificial because I've realized that in the publishing industry, there's a lot of wiggle room, but I wanted to stick to those deadlines. As a result of that, I had a very strict writing process, and I would be at my desk at 10 a.m. Now, this was over the summer, so I wasn't teaching really. And when the Daily Show came on, my wife would hit me over the head and say, enough's enough, come on, watch Jon Stewart. So it was a long, long day of writing. But what I would do is write for a couple of hours, take an hour off, walk the dog around the block, write for a couple of hours, then I would take a long bike ride through the Cleveland Metro Parks, hour or so. Come back, write for a couple of hours. So that was pretty much it. And I'm now working on my third book, and I'm trying to get back into that process again of steady writing. So much is going on right now with the marketing of Captive Condition, and I've been traveling a lot with that I haven't been able to dedicate myself to the writing quite as much, but I'm hoping to get back to it very soon.
Yeah, you do teach. You are a teacher, and this is a question I've been asking everyone that I'm interviewing. Do you think that creativity can be taught, or is it something innate within us?
That's a tough one. There is a big debate going on right now about that. And I think people are getting pretty emotional about it and upset. I've been following a lot of the Facebook stuff where there's arguments going on about innate creativity, or can you go to an MFA program and learn how to write? I think you must. Those MFA programs must serve a population and must teach them the techniques of writing, which are very much needed. But can you teach that creative spark? I'm not exactly sure. One thing that I will tell you from my own experiences of teaching creative writing is this: everybody has a story to tell. Everybody wants to be a storyteller. They've got an interesting story. That's fine. But what a lot of students don't have, from what I have seen, is the ability to write, to get those ideas and those stories on the page in a way that is engaging for a reader. So what I found from teaching is really what I was teaching was writing, not creativity. I was teaching them how to write, and sometimes even how to write correct grammar. And they resisted this. They didn't want to learn how to write. They didn't want to learn how to create effective sentences, how to develop a paragraph, how to create rhythm and flow, how to structure a story or a longer piece even. They just wanted to tell their story. And then the other part of that was many of the stories were either thinly disguised autobiography, and it was pretty obvious that it was autobiography, or they were fan fiction. I got a lot of zombie stories, a lot of steampunk stuff too. I'm not all that familiar with, so I didn't even feel qualified to critique that work.
Well, I know it as a form of art and jewelry, and I think it's really cool and fashion. I didn't even know that there was steampunk literature. Speaking of some of the modern things, like with you, from the descriptions of your book with the horror and everything, it seems to me that it would fit well with a graphic novel or a zine. Have you ever branched out into that, or is that anything that you would ever think about doing?
I never thought about that. I was just in San Diego at ComicCon, though. I don't know if you're aware of this. And I thought, what a strange match that they would send me to ComicCon. So maybe it would lend itself to the graphic novel. And while I was there, one of the other authors, there were only a couple of us from Knopf Doubleday Group. One of the other authors was a graphic novelist. So who knows? Although I would say that if you take a look at the book, the emphasis there is really placed on the prose. Although with the prose, I am trying to create a lot of vivid imagery. So it's possible.
So talk a little bit more about Comic-Con. It sounds so exciting. Did you get to meet any of your idols or any things that happened there that were really cool that you'd like to share with us?
The famous movie stars and the great directors and producers and so on, they're totally inaccessible at Comic-Con, and they must sneak these people into these gigantic lecture halls, and people wait in line for hours and hours, and sometimes they even camp out overnight just to get into the hall to see, J.J. Abrams and Star Wars or Game of Thrones or The Walking Dead. It's an absolute and total zoo. It's mind-boggling. I can't even describe this. But a little guy like me who's trying to get his big break and get a little bit of recognition, I just sit at a booth on the main floor and people just sort of pass by, and it's almost like I'm window dressing in some ways. But it's really overwhelming. I mean, it's easy to get lost in the crowd down there. I did have a book signing, and that was exciting, and there was a long line for that. I was shocked. I thought no one's going to show up to have their book signed by some guy that no one's heard of, but there was I think we went through 85 copies of the book. So that was very, very nice and good for the ego,
Not a bad number.
Yeah. But no, unfortunately, I didn't get to see any of the people I really admire. Saw a lot of people dressed up. I saw a lot of people dressed like Chewbacca and things, but no.
You mentioned Stephen King at the very beginning of the interview, and I saw an interview with him, things that propelled me into wanting to do this topic of the creative spirit. And he said that there has been times where he's like, he thinks he's out of body. He doesn't know what happens. Like he's gone and he comes back and there's writing on the page, so he must be like sort of channeling or something. Have you ever had an experience where you knew that something really transcendent had happened?
Those are the best moments with writing and creativity. I find that most of it is just plain old hard work. And I like to tell people, and my students especially, that it's really not about writing. It's about rewriting, and polishing those sentences. But every so often, I'll have this almost transcendental moment, I guess I would describe it as. It might sound a little bit corny, but I'd say maybe once a day I'll have this 10 or 15-minute moment of euphoria where I just know that the idea is right and it's pouring out of me all of a sudden. So now I've got this great idea. It has suddenly appeared to me in a flash in that 10, 15 minutes. But now the rest of the process is making that idea work with the larger context of the novel that I'm working on. And that's sort of the hard work of the thing, which is probably not so fun. And it isn't that feeling of religious euphoria almost. But at least it does happen. Now, the thing with Stephen King, and maybe the reason why he's able to produce one novel every single year, it's possible that his brain is wired in such a way that he's experiencing this stuff for prolonged periods of time and can sustain that, for hours and hours and possibly days. Although I did hear one story about, I don't know if you've heard this about King, when he was writing Cujo, he doesn't remember writing the thing at all. And he was wasted during this. Do you know this? That he would drink everything in the house, and once all of the booze was gone, he would start in on the cough syrup. So he has no recollection of this. I would never try to do that. I can't imagine focusing and writing anything that in the English language while being intoxicated.
With King, I think he must have had a past life in a prison because he wrote The Green Mile, The Depression Era. There's another one.
Yeah, The Shawshank Redemption. Maybe is that the one you're thinking of?
Yeah.
Actually,
that's
one of the books that really inspired me as a kid. I think that one was more, I was in high school, maybe a sophomore in high school. It's from a collection of novellas called Different Seasons. That made a powerful impression on me. And, you really cannot describe that collection as horror at all. I mean, terrible things happen in it. There's no supernatural stuff. There are no ghosts and vampires or anything like that.
So I found that to be a very inspirational story, Shawshank.
Yeah, that's one thing maybe King doesn't get credit for. His stuff actually, in a lot of ways, is very positive. Nasty things happen as it happens in life, really, but a lot of the characters seem to overcome that stuff.
Getting back to the transcendental thing, that's always my main interest. One last question: where do you think it comes from? Do you have any idea, or what would you say if you had to say where it comes from? What would you say?
I went to that Jesuit high school. And I think I was a bit of an iconoclast there because my ideas naturally sort of gravitated to Eastern mysticism. I've always been enthralled by Hinduism and the Upanishads and Buddhism and Zen. That wasn't going over well with the Jesuit priests, I can tell you. But I love Alan Watts. I don't know if you've read Alan Watts's work, and Joseph Campbell and Mircea Eliade, and these guys who have studied the world's mythologies. The beautiful thing about the transcendental, I think, is that it's a total mystery. There is no definitive answer. And I think it would be so boring if someone had the answer and that was it. We all had to sort of abide by this set of rules or principles or kind of religious canon. The fact that no one knows, no one can say with any sort of certainty where this stuff comes from, how it's channeled into this physical gray matter, a bunch of neurons firing. Who knows? It's so mysterious. So I read a lot of books about neuroscience. I love actually the great atheist thinkers too, Richard Dawkins, Christopher Hitchens, Sam Harris. But I see that all of these things seem to be converging on this idea that the universe, the human brain even, is a complete and total mystery. And maybe we'll never get to the bottom of it. But I think that's a beautiful thing. It's something I always try to capture in my novels too, is we're surrounded by mystery, really.
I agree totally that it is indescribable, and any attempt to describe it is selling it short. Well, I'm going to wrap it up here real quick. why don't you tell everybody like what's coming up for you with Vince? If they want to get your books, if they want to get hold of you or read some of your works, why don't you give us a little final wrap up of everything that's going on with you?
Sure. Well, I'm very fortunate. Pantheon is sending me on a bit of a book tour in a day and age where they rarely do that, because it doesn't make too much financial sense when you go off to a book reading or signing, maybe 10 people show up. It's not enough to justify airfare and the hotel room and those sorts of things. The easiest place to find my work would be online. You can look at my blog. It's called kevinpkeating.blogspot.com. There you'll find a lot of links to reviews, interviews, where to purchase the book. Of course, Amazon will always have my work there and easily accessible that way. And I have a Facebook page for my first book, The Natural Order of Things, on Facebook, all one word, and The Captive Condition, all one word, again on Facebook.
All right. Well, Kevin, it's been such a pleasure talking with you today on Inside the Creative Spirit. And we're going to put all the information on the screen, and it'll be below the video, too, if you want to connect with Kevin or read his books. It's been such a pleasure. Thank you so much for being on Inside the Creative Spirit with me. And I look forward to seeing more books from you in the future.
Thank you so much for taking the time to talk to me, Vicki. I sincerely appreciate that.